all right.
Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 364th meeting since we started in February of 2009. We put a speaker in every week, a different subject. We require a speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give an hour to make a presentation, up to an hour. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter we listen only one fool at a time. That's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to what the speaker said, for or against. Our speaker gets the last word, gets comment and close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we introduce our speakers, we have time for announcements. So if anybody has announcements, now's the time to come on up here. Make your announcement.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but tomorrow is Grover's funeral.
That's right. It's a week. And
So it's 4 o'clock at the First Unitarian Church.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hank.
Thank you.
That was good.
That was good, Hank.
Where is the First Unitarian?
The First Unitarian is on it's 1 block north, well, 2 blocks north of Mockingbird on Preston Road, near Normandy there.
It's on Normandy Avenue.
Normandy Avenue in Preston, which is about 2 blocks north of Mockingbird Road in Preston. So,
Okay, thanks.
so give you some
4
directions
o'clock,
to get there.
right?
4 o'clock tomorrow. What's that? No, it's 4 o'clock. Any other announcements? No? No other announcements? Well, our meeting next week is what is happening to our election system and how it may impact our future. E. Robert Smith, author, will discuss this. I'm not going to read all this. It's on your itinerary, and that'll be next week. Our speaker tonight is Katherine Savers McGovern. She's sitting right here. She's going to talk about on the counter-democracy impact of the Trump administration's Deconstruction plan. She's a retired assistant United States Attorney, Dallas, 2012 Democratic nominee to U.S. Congress, District 32. She has practiced at the McGovern Law Office since April 2011. She was also a delegate to the 2016 Democratic National Convention. She will discuss how the counter-democracy pledge of Donald Trump to deconstruct administrative government is wrongly intended to undermine the implementation of the laws of the United States in violation of the Constitution, separation of powers, and rights of Americans. She will outline how the Constitution has 3 equal branches of government: the executive, legislative, judicial. The President heads the executive branch and is responsible for the operation of the executive department, which carry out the laws passed by the legislative branch. Only the executive branch, through its various departments, commissions, agencies, etc., is authorized to issue rules and regulations to implement the laws passed by the legislative branch and sign the law by the executive branch through the President. Katherine will argue that Trump's use of executive orders, executive memorandums, and/or executive proclamations to subvert the operation of laws enacted pursuant to the Constitution is dangerous and subverts American democracy. To illustrate these points, you will select Representative EO's executive orders impacting on specific executive departments, agencies, or existing rules and regulations, and challenge the legality of the executive orders. In conclusion, Katherine will present the challenge that is incumbent on all Americans to speak up, challenge and resist such actions, and insist on the application of the rule of law consistent with our Constitution. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Katherine Savers McGovern.
I have to say that it's always fun to come here, but I'm not going to write as big a synopsis of what I'm going to say, because by the time Tom finishes reading it, I feel like I ought to just do something else, you know. But what we are looking at is a very unsettling time in our democracy, and that's whether you are for or against, or voted for or against the president, because there is a disruption. And the disruption is something that the president says that he is, he calls himself, I'm the disruptor. That's what I was elected to do. But I disagree with that. He was elected to serve as president. And I think that he actually doesn't understand, has never read the Constitution, and has no apparent ability to separate out what his role is from what his campaign was. He does have people working for him, some of whose names have been known to us all. Obviously, Steve Bannon and his sidekick Miller, and a number of the people who are writing speeches and giving him advice. But as you'll find out as we go along, the advice is not that which is going to help either the people who voted for him or all of us who deserve to have him represent all of America's interest. And that's why we have to have some kind of go back to basics. Now, everybody understands that the American form of government is a democracy. It's based on fundamental statements of principles in the Declaration of Independence and on the rule of law as stated in our Constitution as amended, because we have amended our Constitution from time to time. But the core principles go back to Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, which establish a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, which are co-equal and which serve as checks and balances one to another, so that the executive is not more powerful than the judiciary or the legislative branch. Similarly, the legislative and judicial branches are not more powerful than the executive branch, but each has a responsibility to perform their duties. And these duties are set out in the way that our Constitution, organized us as a government. So we have the duty of the president to serve as our head of government and to oversee the operations of the executive departments and agencies and commissions which have been created over the 200 plus years that our country has formed as a government to fulfill services to the people of the United States. And these laws that have been passed to create, whether it's the Department of Defense, the Appalachian Regional Commission, the Federal Communication Commission, the Department of Education, all of these are created by the representatives who were elected by the people in the various states of the United States. That tells us that these different organizations that carry out the administrative functions of the government are really important. So there's been, some of us have lived a long time. I just claimed 3/4 of a century this week of life, and I'm looking forward to whatever's ahead. But the fact is, if you live a long enough time, you see stuff and you learn from what has happened. Like, I remember during the McCarthy period, before that we were all very afraid of the communists, that they were going to take over. And so McCarthy was able to use that fear and build on it. And then we had really crazy stuff happening, like teachers were supposed to swear that they were not communist, as if there was an assumption that if you were a teacher, you were a suspect and you were possibly a communist, and that to prove you weren't, you had to swear you weren't. Well, I bet there's not a single person in this room that doesn't see how circuitous that is. First of all, if you were a communist and you were trying to subvert, you're not going to have any problems swearing a lie. And, you know, why would a segment of our fellow citizens be forced to swear to something which assumed that they were not innocent, rather guilty, and they then had to say they weren't guilty? I mean, we've been through this in our lifetime or through reading history, so we know what it feels like and why it's not something that we want to repeat. Now, with the Trump presidency, there were a lot of things that he said on the campaign trail which were ranged from horrific to dumb. And, you know, I'm not saying that Hillary didn't say things that I also didn't agree with, but, you know, campaigns are campaigns, and we hope that whoever gets elected, when elected, will pull together to form a cabinet and get people into the structure of government so that it can run, because clearly the president cannot run all the aspects of government. You know, we have too much of it, and nobody should be expected to. That's why he has a cabinet. But what his plan seems to be, and this is based on what one of his chief advisors, Steve Bannon, has been saying for years, is that you really need to deconstruct the government, which is a code for break it up, make it less. There are things that he doesn't think a government should be doing, and that may be his view, and America has the right to have the view. But that doesn't mean he's right, and that doesn't mean that if we have had the government and its functions passed into law to create bodies of jurisdiction to perform services for the people of the United States, he's not elected to kind of be president and say, I'm going to rule that you do not have the right to do this. But that appears to be what he thinks he can do. Now, since I think it's 120 days now, maybe it's a little more, I'm not counting exactly, but anyway, since he became president, he's signed 32 executive orders. Now, I, like you, wasn't paying prior to this presidency that much attention to executive orders or to executive memorandum or proclamation, you know, the flags are at half-mast, whatever. But in this case, what the president appears to think is that when he signs a piece of paper that has a title of executive order, that because as president he signs it, it becomes law. Now, he has learned on the Muslim ban orders that no, that's not the way to say he's learned might be an overstatement, but he has come to recognize that yes, he can sign an executive order, he can tell the Department of Homeland Security to implement his order, but where the order is contrary to our Constitution or to what the Immigration Naturalization Act and as amended its provisions, or other provisions that deal with people who come into this country lawfully, like they come on visas, or they come as refugees, or they come as asylum seekers. If they have permission under one of those three areas, you know, to come into the government, the country, you can't just say midstream, no, we don't like your religion and you can't come in. And I think he is learning that no matter how many times he says it's totally within my authority as president to deal with foreign affairs, that's not quite a proper or correct interpretation of the constitutional provisions under Article 2 that he is trying to rely on. But this is the thing. As long as he believes that he is able to unilaterally sign an executive order, put it in a nice leather folder, have people around him, and hold it up, and that makes it law. It presents a problem and a threat to all of us. We can look at it whether or not we're talking about the Affordable Care Act, which includes a lot of guaranteed protections that had to be in that law. Clearly, having amendments to it to make it work better is a good idea. But he, as executive, cannot just say, don't follow the law which is on the books. And yet he's tried to with one of his executive orders. He has done this executive order which is called the Mexico policy. And in that he has tried to say, he has ordered the agencies of the United States, I believe it impacts the Department of Agriculture, the State Department, the Department of Defense, that you cannot give money to a foreign country whose agency that you would be helping, if they inform the women that they are serving that they can have what contraception is and what a termination of pregnancy is, and so they lose all that. Well, in this last one that he has signed, it's being interpreted by the Department of Health and Human Services, as Mr. Price, Secretary Price, to mean that you also couldn't get money for HIV and AIDS medications. And there are a number of, anything. If your medical clinic in Africa was providing medical services and getting funding in part or a grant from the United States, if you provide information on contraception or termination of pregnancy, they may choose to stop the funding so that you also cannot take care of treating people who have, like I said, AIDS, Ebola. There are a lot of clinics that serve people more broadly than simply women's issues. But that's the position they're taking. Now, right now we don't know exactly what's going to happen but that's an example of what I'm talking about. You have 3 agencies, departments of government which have been authorized by Congress and have been budgeted, money has been given to fulfill this purpose of providing medical care to grants. If he, by executive order, can say, well, you can only give medical grants for the health purposes that I approve because of my religious views, is that consistent with our constitutional principles? It's not do I or do you believe in contraception or AIDS or termination of pregnancy. It is whether or not the president, because of his religious beliefs, can change the authorization that was enacted by Congress which funded these grants. I say no, but we'll find out what the judicial branch says when and if these cases come up. You have what I call reverse rulemaking, which is what that is. But as an example, there is an act that's called the Administrative Procedures Act. Now, in the Administrative Procedures Act, there are provisions that provide notice to people, citizens, companies, businesses, whatever, that are doing business in the United States. So, when Congress passes a law that, like in the Environmental Protection Agency, they have passed laws that support the Clean Water Act as amended, which within the Clean Water Act, there's the Safe Drinking Water Act, there is the act that doesn't allow you to put pollutants dump pollutants into waters of the United States and so forth. But before any rule or regulation can be actually enacted and put into law, it has to be drafted by the agency that has involved. So we'll stick with the EPA. They then put out what's called a notice of rulemaking, and that's published in the Federal Register, and then it's sent out to entities that are known to be impacted. But the idea is that it's a public notice, and it has to be publicly available in many forms, not just in the little 4-point font in the back of your newspaper. So what happens is that once that is done, then people are told how, if they want to comment on something, they can comment on it, and where to send it, where to send their comments, how many pages you can use to make a comment, and so forth. And it also would tell you how to have access, since all comments are public. They're not like a private note from one lobby group or company to another, to the federal agency. These are public. So people can then come in and file another comment about somebody else's comment. But anyway, then there can be a hearing, and that's also noticed. People can sign up and people can go speak. And it's public, you can go listen to it. So finally, after all of that's done on a rule, and all of the comments from all of the people who have any interest in the rule in terms of how it might impact them have submitted them and been heard, then the agency will issue a final order. And the way that's done at the EPA, and I believe that, well, this is true for all agencies, and departments, there is a group or part of it that has responsibility for the secretaries. So all of the comments on the rule that was proposed are taken in, and then a redrafted recommendation is made internally as to the value or the merits of the comments, if they suggest a change, whatever. And then a final rulemaking is issued, and in that final rulemaking you have the actual rule, and you also have all of the comments that were submitted. So this is not something that's just done willy-nilly by any federal agency. It's done with a lot of public input. You have the input of the private. You have more than one source. It's not just the agency whipping out a rule willy-nilly. So once it becomes final and is published in the notice of federal register, as a notice in the Federal Register for 30 days, and then the effective date goes into effect, that rule has the power of law. It has the impact of law. So, as I think you all are aware, during the Obama years and also during the George W. Bush year, well, probably every year that there's been a president, that there's been laws and enacted or regulations, there have been people who have not liked them too well, even though they were enacted. So Congress, back in the 90s, passed a law called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress, if it wants to have a joint resolution. And that can repeal a final rule that an agency or department has passed if it's acted within less than a year of when the final rule became final. So that brings me to the next thing the president has done.
No.
I'm sorry, did you?
Have we ever done it? I've never heard of it.
Well,
Done. Later talk.
I'll listen. I'll take
It's one of those blank rules on the books.
No.
Questions?
Yeah.
I'm not asking questions.
I misunderstood. I knew that we all fools get one to talk, but one at a time, and so I'm going to stick with that rule. But
I didn't mean to interrupt.
anyway, moving on. an example of how that works, there has been a rule that was passed by the Department of the Interior dealing with the streams, what could go in streams. Now, some of you all may be aware that the Department of Interior, through its, let me bring this up just for a second. I tried to remember everything, but I admit I don't. It's the Stream Protection Act. Now, some of you all are aware that in areas of the country where there is mining, that particularly in the Appalachian region, which impacts Kentucky and Virginia, Tennessee a good amount, the preferred approach to coal mining is to take off the top of the mountain and access the coal. But when you take off the top of a mountain, you have a lot of debris left over. So what happened, and this was over like a 5-year or 6-year period of the Department of Interior trying to have a rulemaking and getting it out and getting the comments, they finally passed a rule that said you cannot just put your debris into the valleys and to the stream, the streams where they would get into the streams and had the potential for either clogging them up with silt, or because the minerals that are involved in coal mining, it's the coal's there, but there are other minerals that can be hazardous or pollutants or carcinogens. So they have these rules that finally got passed, and it was the one thing that the president did almost like within the first 10 days of his presidency. The House and the Senate passed this joint resolution to repeal the stream protection rule, so that now the debris from the coal mining is going to be available. It's going to be in the valleys and in the streams. Some of you all may remember that last year, maybe 16 months ago, there was a very significant break in one of these holding ponds, as they call them, where the wall gave way and the hazardous materials that were in it got into one of the large rivers in the Appalachian area. But that's gone now. And so we have an example of something that Congress had already passed, the implementing law that dealt with this form of mining, so that you would have a protection for the environment. But they took them 8 years to try to get a rule through, and they finally got one through. And because of this act that's in Congress that was passed and signed by George Bush, they can do just what they did, that is repeal it. So you have that. But why, when you think about it, why would President Trump, who had many other things that were more important, priorities that one would consider more important. I mean, after all, they've talked for years they're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They've talked for years about doing something on tax reform. They've talked for years about taking care of the military and the veterans and so forth. But the reason they did it is they could do it because the House and the Senate are Republican and the President was Republican. So it becomes like a check mark. Here is something I've accomplished. We'll see how well that is, because the idea that was promulgated by Trump and his supporters was that if they did not have the stream protection rule, then there would be more coal mining, people would gain more jobs, and that would help the economy. So we'll see, but most reports are saying, no, that's not what's going to happen. You'll have the pollution, you'll maybe get 174, not 2,000 or 3,000 jobs. But I don't think they counted on the increased employment in medical providers and people who are, provide medical services related to the exposure to hazardous waste and to these pollutants. So when we are talking about deconstruction, the president's way of deconstructing is, as I have provided examples, but you also have under the Clean Water Act, excuse me, I'm gonna reach over here and get my water. I'm back. You can look at the way that the president has passed his, has proposed a budget. Thank you, Tom. All right, now the budget is really just the president's budget, proposed budget. It doesn't mean that that's what the final product is gonna be. But as you know, if you looked at the budget, another step in the deconstruction of the administrative state, as they call it, is that you cut out the money. So they want to reduce the Department of State by 30%. They want to reduce, the funding. They want to reduce the funding for the EPA approximately the same. They want to reduce the funding for all of the federal departments and agencies that are not military. When you do that, that doesn't mean that the laws go away, but if you only have one person to inspect 2,000 mines or 2,000 food processing plants, that 365 days in a year, you're not going to be able to do it. If you've only got 2 scientists to review the results of testing that you've done, if you've gone out to test waters of streams or water sources, you can see how this works. So, and if you receive, as some of us do, Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, your opportunities to get the service, if you're a veteran, to get the service that you've paid for because you have, as you work during your working years or your spouse's working years, you had paid in to the fund that secures the payment later of Medicare or Social Security. So you're not going to get those people to respond, not because they don't like you, but because they're not there. So when you are, and if you want to have education funding, say you think that we ought to do something more in education, or at least make sure that the money that we have spent on an education grant, to a state, to whatever, to a school, you want to see what the accountability is. You want to have somebody go out and ask for the records concerning how you spent the money. We've had this in Dallas recently where the Federal Department of Housing, of HUD, Housing Administration Authorization, has been asking the city of Dallas to account for 30, I think it's 30 million. It's not a nickel and a dime. It's a pretty good wad of money. And they don't have the records. Well, if you don't fund the administrative side of an agency so that they can go out and check, then you're not going to have the ability to follow up to see what has happened to the taxpayers' money. So it really matters. When people are talking about deconstructing or having a smaller government, we need to understand how that really translates to what we do. We have heard and seen a lot with respect to how the veterans that are supposed to receive care through the VA are not getting the care that we as taxpayers expect and the vets expect. And so I know that, like that you all have been listening as long as I have through several administrations about we're gonna do more, we're gonna take care of our vets. But again, the proof is in the pudding. Where's the funding? Where's the staff? Where's the accountability? When you have a budget such as what President Trump has proposed to reduce the amount of money that's available to every federal agency, unless it's the military or Homeland Security, but they even cut the Coast Guard's budget because apparently the president didn't realize what the Coast Guard does. I think somebody told him, and that might get fixed, but it's a consistent attack on the government being able to function. So we have the use of executive orders to undercut and slow down the enforcement or implementation, thank you, just needed that extra syllable. Anyway, you cannot have the functions do what they're supposed to do. If you look at the Department of Commerce, now many people probably think, how important is the Department of Commerce? Well, maybe not too much, unless you think that the Import-Export Bank is important, because that's at the Department of Commerce. If you think the trade, I think it is, but I may be wrong, you may be right. But the Department of Commerce is the entity working when internationally too with the State Department that deals with this country's trade with other countries. We always talk about, maybe a trade agreement is good or it's bad or whatever. But if you start taking away the resources that the Department of Commerce has, then you are not going to have the number of people, the number of experienced people available to actually do the work that is entrusted at the Department of Commerce by the laws that have been passed by the Congress and signed by prior presidents. You look at the Department of Labor. Now, if one of the things that the president is wanting to do is to slow down the enforcement of laws that deal with labor, wage and hour, safety on the job, things of that nature. Now, if you are a worker, if you have sons and daughters who are workers, then you know that sometimes accidents happen, and sometimes it's it's because the work site isn't safe. And so then you want people not only to take care of the person that was injured, but separately from that, you want people who are responsible for doing inspections to see if the labor laws are being followed. That's really part of what our taxes pay for. So the risk that we are facing is through these executive orders which want to slow down or stop regulations. Now and money. They want no money, and they want to stop the rules and regulations that exist to the extent they can. Now, because of the Administrative Procedure Act, you can't just wipe them away. You have to, if you're going to take them away, you have to give the notice, you have to have the comment period, you have to have the hearing, all of the things that I went through earlier. But say instead what you want to do is to impede the creation of a regulation. Now, anyone who has read a statute that has been signed and become a part of the United States Code recognizes that it is broad in scope many times. The reason is that we are a diverse and broad country, so that trying to write a law that will be specific to its operation in Texas would be totally inappropriate for an operation in Maine, for example. So that's why when these laws are passed, there's a provision in the law which enables, if it's labor, if it's commerce, if it's interior, if it's defense department, whatever, that those agencies are given the authority and the power to enable appropriate rules and regulations to implement the law that has been passed. So what the President has done with one of his executive orders, actually he's done 3 of them that deal with regulations and burdensomeness, but he has done a couple of things which create a real problem for the functioning of laws that are passed, because he has, in his executive order, he says, well, if you got to go to the Director of Management and Budget, and he has to say that it's right, but you have got to, you being the federal agency, if you want a new regulation to implement a law that has been passed and which you have been given the responsibility for enforcing and articulating for people to know what it means, if you want to enact a regulation, engaged in rulemaking, and those are used interchangeably under the Administrative Procedure Act, you have to, first of all, go to the Director of Management and Budget and say, or to our Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, and say, we need to enact this regulation, and here are 2 more that we will trade off because we need to get this one done. Now, the fact of the matter is that if you're going to trade off a rule, 2 rules that have been enacted according to the Administrative Procedure Act, you have to do what's called the notice. You have to put it out for comment. All the steps we've talked about, and it's subject to judicial review. But you also have to show what the cost is. And that is a very vague and tricky thing, because if you are going to enforce the rule, and it's going to cost any rule that's being enforced is going to cost whoever the rule applies to probably spend a little money, maybe some money, maybe more, a lot of money. And so what you have to do is to document that it's not going to cost more than it benefits. Well, that's a pretty abstract idea. I mean, it's a good idea. I kind of like it, saying, okay, we ought to have a cost-benefit analysis. But when you get into the specifics of the cost and whose benefit and who values it, you can see that that too presents a problem. But what it actually does is it creates dysfunction, because there are too many steps to go forward and have a rule which should be implemented, because a law that was passed by Congress and signed by the President requires the agency to take steps, XYZ steps. And it's almost impossible to do it because you cannot get approval. You can't get through the approval steps to do it. Years ago, I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, and there was a rulemaking that had come up dealing with the fact that smoking tobacco can cause you cancer. And so that had all been put out for notice, comments, everything. So the rule was ready to be published as a final rule, but it had to go through Dan Quayle, whom some of you all may remember as the vice president with George I. And so I'm sorry, but anyway, I could not hear that, but I will go back to the rule. Only one fool talking at a time. I get to be the fool on with the mics. So anyway, that Dan Quayle held that rulemaking up, that final rule up, and the science that went with it to justify why they were going to require tobacco companies to post advertisements to otherwise inform the public that this was not a guess. It actually would cause you cancer. Maybe not everyone would get cancer, but enough would that they needed to be warned as a public health and safety matter. So finally, after the, I think it was Bill Clinton, as I believe, followed George won. So then the proposed rulemaking went final, and we got all of those rules that relate to informing the public of the consequences of smoking tobacco, including secondhand smoke, which was also held up because they did not want to anger the tobacco companies, because that's where the money was coming from at that point in time. You can see this happening now with respect to the rules on climate change. The president has issued an executive order, in which he sets out, we've got to look at this again, but he also specifies probably 10 executive orders or rules. You can't just wipe away rules, but all of which deal with climate change and the science which shows that it's real. Not only does the rulemaking require this to be pulled back, the actual printed notifications of the science that reports that were done, are going to be withdrawn, and may have been by now. I have not followed it that closely, but you can see what he is able to do using the executive authority he has. But what that does is it takes away the factual information that many scientists engaged in testing and the gathering of data to submit reports which were peer-reviewed and came out with a decision that yes, climate change is real, and yes, we have, if we want to have our world ready for the next 2 generations and more, we're going to have to change some of the things that we do. So that is what I'm trying to use as an illustration of how this president and the actions that he is taking, because they are so broadly done, is taking away from every American information that's important to your well-being, to your knowledge, and to students who are studying, whether you agree or don't agree. If our tax monies have been used for scientific studies which meet the criteria of peer review, they should be available on governmental websites. They're being taken down. All of this leads to ignorance. It doesn't make America stronger, and it causes America to be weaker because it deprives us of the opportunity to learn the facts and to try for ourselves. Now I see my friend Tom, who's going to hand me my water and go then give you all a microphone so you can ask me some questions. I did bring some samples of what these executive orders look like, and I didn't know if anyone was interested, but I would pass them around. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, Tom, I'll ask you to pass that way. This is a pack which deal with the issue of what is the definition of the waters of the United States. I'm gonna pass this around, but I wanted to let you know there are 2 Federal Register notices. One that was put out during the Obama administration, and then this most notice, the current one. And what the difference is that the current one relies on an opinion by Justice Scalia on a piece of legislation challenging the rule on waters, what were waters of the United States. And then prior to that, in 2008 and 2015, there were other cases in which the Obama administration, in the same decision that the Trump administration cites, but they are relying on what Justice Kennedy said about what is the proper definition of a navigable water of the United States. I think that's interesting. It may just be the lawyer in me, but here they come. Yeah, you all, I'm done. If you've got any questions, or if you just want to jump up here and do your rebuttal.
It's been claimed that a lot of the executive orders by President Trump are a charade. That is, that they say, to the extent allowable by law, which means they can't be enacted anywhere, and they're just done as a piece of theater to appease his supporters. So I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Well, based on the ones that I have read, and I've tried to read all 32, and it is sometimes snooze time, but there is some standard language which are in all executive orders, so I don't think that President Trump's are different. But they, being an executive order, his authority is limited by the laws that he's trying to impact. So that's sort of CYA language. But what you see is that in the first couple of paragraphs, he will try to say what he's trying to do. And that is what the secretary of whatever department he's sending in that is going to try to do, unless there is a lawsuit that stops him. That's what happened on the first Muslim ban, and may try happen on this next one. I don't know. And then when we get to the Affordable Care Act and his, the law that may or may not get passed. It's so iffy, you don't know what's going to happen. But you have to know the code when you're reading the acts, the orders, because it's what he says, not the CYA paragraphs that I think matter.
But the point is, some of them, though, seem to be theater to appease his followers without any real impact.
None of them have impact unless they are consistent with the applicable law and the Constitution of the United States. So you're right that he uses the signing of these executive orders in a very theatrical way, as marketing back to his base. And so I don't disagree with you on that. I do take seriously what he is trying to do because of the impact that it can have if he is able to have the department that he is aimed at do what he is saying. So it's kind of a catch-22. Yeah, it doesn't in and of itself take care of anything, but it could well still have negative impact. So, are there any other questions?
Catherine,
Yeah.
with regard to executive orders, I see you're kind of taking a narrow focus there. Have you examined the executive orders of other presidencies prior, especially Obama, means of executive orders. I do know Ron Paul ran on the idea that he would pass one executive order to cancel all executive orders and no more executive orders. But Ron Paul is not in office, so anyway, what's your response?
Well, since what I said I would do tonight is come and talk about Trump's orders, I didn't come prepared to go and discuss prior executive orders, but I am confident that there's not a president that has come forward that hasn't used executive orders to the extent that they could. And I believe that certainly President Obama did. And in some cases they were successful. In some cases he got pushed back, just like President Trump has.
And have you looked at the issue that perhaps President Trump's executive orders are simply dealing with overreach of Obama's executive orders?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he hates President Obama. So, but I think he doesn't like George W. very much either. So I would say that, and some of his executive orders specifically reach back to executive orders that were passed during the George Bush years and during Bill Clinton's years. They go back to 1993. So I believe that his executive orders are based on a much broader agenda than any of the ones that either President Obama passed or signed or President Bush I signed. I'm not going to try to tell you that I've read all of them, but like you, some have been more publicized than others, and that's the basis for my comment.
Yes, Catherine. Do executive orders have a basis in the Constitution?
Well, that's interesting. There's no term in the Constitution, but when I was researching for this to get more information about where the rule of law and executive orders fall, there is some broad language in Article 2 which allow the president to comment. I think that's where the authority comes from, and the challenge is because the executive orders are tied to specific legislation, and as we were just talking about, have the CYA language always about, this is only intended to go as far as the laws allow. That seems to be the way the courts, to the extent that an executive order, comes before them, they're not questioning whether the president has the authority or the ability to issue an executive order. I've sometimes wondered about these signing statements that President George W. Bush used a lot when a bill was passed, into law that he didn't agree with, but he felt like he had to sign it for a reason or that dealt with the whole of the bill and all the provisions in it, that he would say that he didn't agree with a certain part of the bill and there might not be enough money to enforce it.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you have any idea of solutions?
Well, Hillary was my solution.
Yeah, so that's not happening right now, right? Or do you still want her, do you want to push her back in?
Well, I couldn't quite hear what you said, but
you don't have any other solutions? Would you endorse or distance yourself from radical things like that are being pushed on mainstream news, like Maxine Waters?
well, what I am doing, and this is what I think a lot of people are, is being a part of, for lack of a better word, what's called the resistance, or people who speak up. Like I went to Washington and I was among the 500,000 women and men who were marching on the 21st of January. And so, and I have participated and continue to participate in supporting, like on the Muslims. I have a lot of friends who are Muslim, and I really am offended by the effort of this administration to use these executive orders.
You're just listing another complaint. Do you have any solutions?
The solution is the one we all have, and that is that we speak up and try to persuade others, and that I'm going to work very hard to make sure that as many Democrats get elected at every level of government as possible, because a lot of the problems that we are running into, from my perspective, is because we have allowed ourselves to kind of sit back and say we can't impact something. But for example, in that special election out in Montana, I've contacted them and I've sent a little money out there. I've supported financially the Democrat that's running in Georgia. So there are a lot of different ways that you can reach out to try to have an impact to help balance the scales. But we have a democracy, and it's based on voting, and it's based on elections, and that's the solution. There are times you might have you say you will sue on such and such that you don't think is constitutional, but I can tell you as an attorney that I know a good amount about federal law anyway, and I think this is also true in state law. You have to be able to have what's called standing. That is, that you have personally had a cognizable injury in order to bring a piece of litigation in court to challenge a rule or the implementation of law as not being consistent with the law that is written or inconsistent with the Constitution. But it's not easy, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Sorry to be such a dull person on that answer.
I think it's good to ask for solutions. We just had a primary last year where fully half of the party at the end of the primary felt like the cards had been stacked against them. And I think that the people who won the primary, they never acknowledged that. And so there's going to continue to be a rift in the party, even though Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Donna Brazil, they were both totally disgraced. They did not really lose anything, and nobody's apologized for that. So I think the young people that are needed in this party, which are not in this room, we need young people, and they're not getting their information from CNN and CNBC and NBC. They're getting their information online, so it's far more free range. You have access to information that they don't tell you on NPR.
Try to form it into a question.
Okay, my question is, how do you speak to the young people who are still very angry about being cheated during the primary?
Well, my view is this, that everyone had the opportunity to get out and vote and to get their friends to go vote. And Bernie's people got out to vote, and Hillary's people got out to vote. Sometimes Hillary was successful, sometimes Bernie was successful. What I did, back in 2008, I supported Hillary against Barack Obama because I thought that Hillary was the better candidate. But after Barack was our nominee, I then got out and I worked as hard to elect him as I had worked for Hillary in the primary. I think that what people do that creates a problem for themselves is they expect perfection from our candidates. And I know that you don't agree because I can see you shaking your head, but the truth of the matter is that whatever age group wants to stand up and become involved can, and we are working on a majority vote. When I've seen this so many times in my life, I'm not going to bore you trying to convince you because I know that you know it too. It's like the indivisible groups that have developed all over the place. Most of them are probably 30 years younger than I am. I try to help out and do what I can, and I'm with the Women's March, Dallas-Fort Worth. Everybody that I'm involved with is about 20 years younger than me, but I don't have any problem with there being leads or that, working out ideas that we can work together on. That's what I think is the solution. I don't think we can kind of say, well, they're too young to know anything or she's too old to know anything. I think we all know that what's happened in this election didn't suit us as Americans. This isn't something that's leading toward American values and principles to me. But I do think we cannot ignore all parts of the population. So.
I do have to make, thank you.
Uh-oh.
Yes, I'll be a little bit off. Do you feel that we have an assault on our free press in the United States right now, with our president calling everybody that's in there fake news and saying that he may not even have any more press conferences? Do you think that the authoritarian type people, isn't that the first thing they try to do, is get rid of the free press?
I think that, taking your last question first, certainly we're dealing with an authoritarian who has always had his way. And I do believe that there is an assault on the free press, as well as freedom of speech, freedom of religion.
Do I hear a buzzing?
Excuse me.
Turn the volume down.
Yeah, can we turn the volume down on the handheld?
Yeah,
3.
I did.
There you go.
Okay, let's hope that doesn't feedback now. Okay, go ahead, ma'am.
All right, so anyway, I am of the view that a part of what the president does, probably 90% of what he does, is a barrage of distraction, untruths, outright lies, to let his own base be happy, to keep everyone else off base. And so that's what I see. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's what I think is happening.
Close enough.
Catherine, after my father finished his work as a 4-state regional director for Operation Head Start, he got in on the ground level of the OEO. And he would come home every day talking about how there was such corruption and waste and nepotism and every illegal thing you could imagine going on there, to the point where he believed he had to be the only honest contractor working for the U.S. government and a government agency. Now, what you were saying earlier, really, there was an unchallenged assumption there. You don't think that there is bloat in government agencies? You don't think they need to be on a diet, shall we say?
I think that you really have to look at the federal program and look at who it serves and decide if they have enough money to do the service they're supposed to. So, for example, in early childhood education, do we have enough money allocated to do the work that is a part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is, I think, where the early education subset falls. If you think that we have enough people in that role, then, and don't need more, then I would say there's no bloat there. But let's take a look at the Army. Is it possible that we have bloat in the Army? And I just made that hypothetical. But say you took it down and you looked at a particular section of the Army that was doing a particular sort of job. I would wonder whether or not, if you looked at what the job was, do we have enough people doing that work to provide the service that that we're paying for. If the law has been passed that X services are to be performed by that segment of the Army, then I don't think that if they've got enough people to do it, then I don't think it's bloated. If they've got too many people and don't need it to do the work, it is bloated. What I have seen more frequently over at least 45 years of working for the United States, and I'll tell you that I've worked for two senators, one member of the House, the Library of Congress Legislative Reference Service, the Federal Communications Commission, the EEOC, the Department of Energy, and Department of Justice twice. And what I have seen, Appalachian Regional Commission, what I have seen is that the people who are actually doing the work are generally working more hours than they're being paid to try to actually do the work. That's not, I do remember OEO, I really do, and I do agree that I think that there was a philosophy that pervaded that group, and I mean that, it's not really an agency, but it was part of, I think, the Department of was it Office of Economic Opportunity?
Yes, it was the administrative office.
Right, okay. Anyway, they ran into some problems, as I recall, that the Inspector General finally came down on them for the sort of waste, fraud, and abuse that we all know and love and hear talking about. But in the experience that I have had, I have not seen that to be the case. But I have seen that people who contract with the United States tend to think the money is funny money, and thus they don't have, you know, if they skim a little bit, that's all right, because it's nobody's money. I always looked at it, yeah, it was, because I helped pay those taxes that funded that program. So I look at it a little bit different than you perhaps, but I think that there are places where money is not well spent, that the services that are rendered are not paid attention to, and we should do better. And but I'll tell you a story. I had this case some years ago in which we were dealing with a claim against a company around here that will go defense contractor. So the criticism was that the I'm going to say, I don't think it was the Defense Accounting Office. I think they were the ones who were supposed to be doing the reviews to check to see if they were if there was accountability for what they had bought versus what they received. And at that time, you got everything in paper. So what they would be getting to review would be, I'm going to set this down just a minute. They would be getting reports that were maybe 20 inches thick, containing letter-sized paper that had 25 lines single-spaced that were identifying objects like widgets or whatever the heck it was. And so the report was there, and certainly if you had a way to check, go through all of that without going blind, you would pick up, the $600 toilet seat that was, hidden in there, or things like that. But humans don't have that kind of capability, so once you have to have somebody say, where in that haystack you need to be looking. Once we got computers and could write programs to sort out or to look for aberrations, abnormalities in pricing, you have a better chance. But the cutting out waste, fraud, and abuse is a two-way street in my experience, and that is you have to have businesses that are working with a government that look at their own integrity as to what they submit to be paid for. And you have to have the people in the government have the resources and the number of staff which allow them to do the accounting work or whatever it is they're supposed to be doing.
Were you aware of the recent announcement that $6 trillion is missing from the Pentagon budget?
I noticed that is true. I also noticed that Health and Human Services, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have just sued Humana on Medicaid fraud, which is in the billions. So I don't think the $6 billion is missing. I do think it's unaccounted.
A trillion, man.
Trillions.
Trillion, man.
I don't think it's missing. I do think it's unaccounted for. And I would hope that we can find it, because clearly somebody's got to explain how it is that they paid out that money and didn't keep a receipt. I'm sorry, I have to laugh, but the whole idea.
What did you read that?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, do you think that this dogma-driven agenda of the Trump associates has a hope in hell of making this country great again?
No.
And would you care to comment on that?
Okay.
What do you think is going to happen, actually?
At this point, I don't believe he's going to be able to do the things that he is trying to do, because of the fact that there's so much dysfunction, discordance, and the sequencing for accomplishing some of the agenda items that might be called great in his view. First of all, on the tax reform, to do the tax reform to give the money to the wealthiest people and the wealthiest businesses in the United States, you have to have the Affordable Care Act repealed, and the money that's allocated to pay the subsidies and the money to the states like Medicaid expansion move back so that it can be paying the money to the tax cuts, so you have the revenue to take care of the tax cuts. So if the Affordable Care Act is not repealed and the money isn't taken out of it, then the tax quote reform can't proceed. And I hope that before that happens, we'll move into 2018 and there'll be a change in the balance of power. I'm hoping.
Yes, Catherine, with the Muslim ban, when President Trump says he has every right to do this to protect the people of this country, which I haven't seen since it's been off for 3 months, where is that actually written down? Is it an article, or is it
Are you asking where he says that?
No, I'm asking where is it written that he has, which he claims he has this right to do what he did on an executive order. Where does it say that?
Well, we know that he doesn't have the right to do what he's doing based upon religious discrimination, because our Constitution doesn't allow him to do it. But he thinks he can grab a woman's pussy. What the heck? Of course, that's his thinking. Excuse my French, but you know, when you're dealing with a man that thinks like that, of course he thinks he's got the authority to do what he wants. And if he thinks that the Muslims can be kept out because he wants to keep them out, because he wants to discriminate, that's, you know.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is that he has said he has this authority, which will probably go to the Supreme Court. And what I'm asking is, where does he get that from?
Okay, going past the chutzpah, he is relying on the part of the Constitution that gives to the president the authority to handle foreign affairs. Okay, it's in the executive, in the president. It's in Article 2. So that is what he is using.
Okay, that's what I wanted.
It's not true. He has a specific.
did you say you worked for a time for the EPA?
I did.
I have a question. When the EPA was founded, now, this is my understanding, so correct me if I'm wrong on this. When the EPA was founded, it was founded basically over 2 or 3 hazardous sites that it was enacted to manage. My understanding is now it is managing thousands of sites, and I want to ask, where is the remediation? What is the EPA? It seems that the EPA is able to grow, adding on hundreds of hazardous sites, but no one is doing the needed remediation. So can you answer that?
Okay, the section of the law that is within the implementation for the EPA and also the Corps of Engineers is the what's called RCRA, which is the reclamation of hazardous waste. That's not exactly what RCRA stands for, but anyway, there is a remediation statute now. What happens and where the remediation is that if they find a site, like we can use West Dallas, you know, the entity that created the hazardous site was obligated under the statute to repair it and or remediate it. If the company did not, then the United States did, or supposed to, and then the United States was authorized to go against that company to recover the cost of remediation. So that's the short answer. Now, sometimes you end up with the companies either being judgment-proof or in bankruptcy. When I was acting regional counsel for a while there, we would have notice letters that we would send out to people that, you know, are associated with these hazardous sites. And the letter would say, "Dear Fred, your property has a hazardous concentration of cadmium," just for an example, and it's gonna cost $9 million to remediate it. When do you think you can get started? Well, and you know that Fred can't do that. But it was also sent out to all the companies that had any involvement, all the other people. So that is how the statute's written to deal with the remediation aspects of hazardous waste. You know, I think you all may have seen that story about that site down in Georgia that the president had some ownership in, and it was, it's a hazardous waste site, and so the Georgia is trying to collect from the company that I think he passed on to one of his sons or vice versa. I've sort of forgotten the sequence there, other than it's a Trump family property. And they're still trying to collect from, you know, either one of the Trumps for the remediation of that property. Since he's, you know, the president and Georgia is, you know, I think they voted for him, there may be less pushing by the state to collect that for that hazardous waste remediation. But my point is that whether you are very important, very wealthy individual or company, or you are less, if you have property that has hazardous waste on it, the old rule, at least back when I was there, was that you'd get a letter saying this is a hazardous waste site and we're going to be doing remediate. You'll need to remediate. What can we count on you for? Okay, somebody's bound to tell me to sit down. Thank you all. Those were very challenging questions. I've now got to go rest. Your turn.
Okay, now it's your turn to talk, so whoever wants to be first, come on up here.
I'd like to
address the issue of younger voters, the Bernie Bros, the Never Hillary people, and so on. And I want to do that by telling a little bit of a story. And that is, back in the 1960s, gays and lesbians got involved in the Democratic Party. What we did is we worked to elect Democrats who supported equal rights for gay and lesbian people. We became reliable supporters and reliable voters in the Democratic Party. We got, in 1972, equal rights for gays added to the Democratic Party platform. That had put in motion a series of things, and with gay and lesbian people reliably voting for Democrats and helping to elect Democrats, giving gay and lesbian people a lot of power in the Democratic Party to influence what happened. Now we have non-discrimination laws, we have hate crimes laws, we have the right to marry, and that is all due to the work of gay and lesbian people within the Democratic Party. And if you doubt that, I will point out that in the marriage ruling, for the 5 justices who supported the equal right to marry were appointed by Democrats to the Supreme Court. The 4 who were against it were appointed by Republicans. Now, why is this important? Because what the Bernie Bros and Never Hillary people did is they showed an incredible amount of bad faith by saying, we're going to participate in the nomination process, but if you don't do it our way and we don't get our way, we're going to walk away and we're going to have a temper tantrum and we're going to screw up the election. That's what they did. And they are never, ever, ever going to get any power to influence the Democratic Party until they get involved in the Democratic Party and work to elect Democrats that are more to their liking. But by getting on the outside like they did and saying, well, the Democratic Party doesn't want us, we're going to have to come in, kiss us up, stick up to us, and do what we want before we get involved, that's not the way it works. The way it works is you get in the party, you become a reliable supporter of the party, a reliable Democratic voter, and that's how you get the influence to get what you want. And if you don't do that, what's going to happen is the Democratic Party is going to move to the center, and the people on the left, I'm one of the people on the left, I'm practically a socialist. I prefer the programs that are further to the left, but I guarantee you, if I can't rely on people in the left to vote with the Democratic Party to elect people, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to advocate the Democratic Party moving to the center and picking up the votes and creating the coalition there so we can win elections. Because I got to tell you, if you're in the middle, you're still a hell of a lot further to the left than the Republicans are. And this is what is so extremely frustrating, that these people have the arrogance to say that the woman who has been the most admired woman in the world for 20 years running is somehow not a good candidate for president, and to just throw a monkey wrench in it, not vote for Jill Stein or whatever, and hand the election to Donald Trump. I just think it's disgraceful. I think before the people on the left get back involved in the Republican and the Democratic Party, they're going to have to come. It's not that we need to suck up to them. They need to apologize to us, and they need to pledge that they will actually get in the party and work to make a bigger coalition that respects their views and wants to help them achieve them. And if they don't do that, they're not going to get a damn thing. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, who's next? That'd be next.
Wow. So, I've learned to add something to my vocabulary in these issues. It's called level of analysis. What's the proper level of analysis? When you're looking at an issue, should you look at every little word? Let's say there's a bill up you're contesting. Let's say gay marriage. Should you look at every word, hospital visit, or should you look back further, you know, like a whole party against the whole party? There's a level of analysis. So what's the level of analysis of this talk? To me, all I see is Trump bashing. The solutions were quite reasonable to me. You said, well, I'll keep on voting. Maybe I'll vote harder, whatever that means. The reason I came up to speak, I'm not a Trump supporter, even though I'm not a Democrat. I don't know if that takes a while to process, but it's pretty simple to me. There's lots of different sources of information now. You don't just have to look only at the New York Times or NBC or Fox. There's a lot of information coming out. My concern right now is that there are people younger than us, not too much, like Maxine Waters maybe, that aren't going to wait for elections or anything to do with the Constitution. Maybe George is one of them. You're ready to do something drastic. The mainstream media is pushing this. Problem is, they're pushing it with lies. We have extremely strong is it called the fifth estate, fourth estate?
Fourth estate.
Fourth estate. I think we got 5 now too with the computer surveillance. But they're kind of doing something for the first time where they're kind of like greasing this thing against the government. They want a revolution. They want to get rid of Trump. They want it to go down. I think there's other reasons besides this. I think some of us, we're all being manipulated all the time. If we stay away from violence, that's good. Now, to this point about the Democrats and the process of the Democrats, I just saw something yesterday that the Bernie Sanders people are suing the DNC and Wasserman Schultz, two defendants. And basically, they were suing them because they had proof, pretty strong, that it was a rigged game. It was in for Hillary, even before they collected Bernie Sanders' money. So the big news is this: their only defense is we're allowed to do that, and it's a pretty weak defense. So if you haven't seen that, look that one up. In this day of smartphones and computers, just look up DNC lawsuit. You'll be amazed. It started yesterday. So I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat, and I think it's hard to figure out what the heck Trump is about. But yeah. But I don't like the fervent religious madness that has gripped the people on the left. I know we got a lot of them here, and they're ready to get their young thugs out there. They're better than the real police, and we're going to break something. We're going to take over the state. They don't mind having all kinds of illegal things going on inside the government, undermining the presidency. To me, the whole government thing, you know, is not as hallowed as all these people that vote and do the primaries and everything. Still, this, you know, as we transition to this new technocratic age or one world age, whatever it is, truth is our only defense. And if you get really partisan, you've lost it. So once again, don't put your top allegiance to the party. Thank you.
I usually like to talk after Ray, but Ray's not here tonight. No, what I'd like to talk about is the Muslim ban and how it's going to go to court and go through it. But basically, Yeah, I'm speaking now. And the thing is that when President Trump says extreme vetting, I want to tell you what a refugee is. A refugee is a person or persons that left their country in fear of their life, that left their country with the clothes on their back and nothing else. Now, my church, our Savior Lutheran Church in Mesquite, we have a place called the Bethlehem House, and we house refugees in it. Right now, there's 4 of them in there right now. I have one from Somalia that has his arm cut off. I had another one from Iraq that had his foot beaten half. And I asked him how he did it. I couldn't speak his language, and he spoke a little bit of mine, but it was beat off with a hammer. President Trump talks about extreme vetting. Most of these people, there's a fellow that I met yesterday over there, a little guy from Somalia, and I said, how long did it take you to get here? He said 7 years. 7 years. So extreme vetting is just a name that he liked to say because the vetting goes on. And the Lutheran Refugee Service places these people. We own it. Our Savior Lutheran Church owns the house, and the refugees that come there, some are, you know, it used to be for families, and now they're taking what they can. They even bring people in there without us even knowing it, and that's okay, but they should be going through the pastor and seeing what's going on. So when people say, you know, this Muslim ban, which I'll call it a Muslim ban because that's exactly what it is. And the thing is that there are people that need a place. Europe has taken, in Germany, over 1 million people. We have taken so far about 10,000, and very few. And the country, and Texas especially, doesn't want to take anybody at all. And I think I am ashamed of what my country, that I wore the uniform of, has come to in this day and age. And it's a shame. And if we notice that all these bad guys coming in when he put that thing with an executive order out there, there hasn't been any killings by these people. In fact, most of the refugees are more peaceful than the people we have that are Native Americans. Thank you.
Well, I love to speak after George. Actually, that's an unrealistic. Actually, that's an unrealistic picture. Speaking with special forces, they say there are over 100 terrorist camps here in this country, and there are at least 2 in Texas that they were commenting on, where they are doing weapons training and even exploding bombs. And these are known about. So I guess as far as border issues, I had a customs official who became a friend, John Carmen. He was involved in stopping a irregular railroad car coming into the country, and he got overturned by the White House. It appears they had a special interest in that car that didn't weigh what it should have weighed, and so the order came direct from the White House to let that go. That was during the Bush administration, by the way. As far as the report that we've been given tonight, it has internal consistency, but I would put it to the speaker that it is skin deep. I don't feel that it is addressing issues which many of us are looking at, issues of the deep state, I think whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I think many people would be able to admit that Trump is an outsider. I don't believe he was intended to win. In fact, I was hearing from economic sources that Hillary was going to win. There was no possibility Trump was going to win. The problem is that there is a huge amount of criminality that has been building over the last administrations. I'm not just singling out the Obama administration. There's a lot of criminal activity going on. And you get an outsider in the catbird seat, you have a problem, because this then can be exposed. I'm hearing that billions of dollars left Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and went to shore up the Obamacare funds, completely against the law. There are some huge issues of things that have gone on that are ripe for exposure. And we have a media, I should call it the mockingbird media, for those with ears to hear, who really are in lockstep against Trump. It's 98% negative reporting on him. And if y'all don't recognize negative reporting, I mean, when is the last time you heard a positive word said about anything the man did? And the type of resistance he's getting from the Republican establishment, from different lobbies and so forth, he seems to be a threat to about everybody. So even though the man has stumbled, he's done things I don't really agree with, I'm still nominally at this point supporting him, and hope that he turns around and makes good on some of his campaign promises. Because I don't like the or else. I don't like it's kind of like those who have been exposed as being against him. It's amazing. I mean, it's like a whole laundry list. And I think right now the swamp is winning. I don't think the draining worked. I think the drain got plugged.
It's filled.
Yeah, but so it's an interesting show. I don't think we've had anything like this in the history of this country, where a president has gotten this much negativity. Normally, we go, we vote, okay, we lost. I mean, I as a conservative, my candidates lost a lot of times, and I'm like, okay, you know, the Democrats, they've got it the next 4 years. You know, we'll try to challenge what we can, but the attitude this time around from the Democrats and from the establishment is no, hell no. This guy is not going to do a thing. He's not going to be allowed to be president. So I think, you know, the Obama's actions in the last month of his administration, most lame duck presidents, you know, they play more golf or something. He was in high action that last bit. So it's an interesting time here in this country. And when we talk about values, I would remind you that there are two views on this. I think the country is going too much collectivist. I think that collectivism in various forms is spoken of and not even really recognized. If you look at the founding documents of the country, it's for the individual. It's recognized that the individual is the active agent. From there, you have the states. And the states have power. If you look at the 9th and 10th Amendment, this is really all about how any power not specifically given to the federal government is reserved to the states and to the individuals. And if you see a lessening or paring back of the government, maybe it's because someone is recognizing that and saying, you know, we could do this a more constitutional way. We could let the states decide a lot of these matters that the federal bureaucracy or the federal administration has really been kind of working on ponderously. I mean, where did BLM get the power to be seizing ranches on the Texas-Oklahoma border? You're talking about the streams. That's kind of related to treaties of the seas and some of the legislation on streams, where BLM is just coming in and they're taking over. They're saying, well, this is the new border, and we own your ranch now. And I know ranchers who are fighting that. Some years ago, I did interviews with some people from the Texas border with Mexico, and I mean, it's horrendous down there. This one lady, she had gunshot wounds, she had stabbing wounds, she had rape attempts. She said normally it was about 200 refugees coming across her property every night. They killed over a dozen dogs. She lost cattle, goats, and it was a really horrible situation, and she wasn't getting any help from the local sheriff. So, you know, our borders, are we going to have borders? Are we going to have a culture here? Or are we going straight into this North American Union thing, which nobody really wants to define exactly how that's supposed to work? So, I mean, that's the big question for me. I could go on, but I think my time's up.
John, we know you can go on.
John, run for president.
Well, okay, well, I just, two days ago I was in England, so I'm back here in Trump country. You know, what we see going on really is like a wrecking ball, because the country and many countries have institutions, and there seems to be an attempt to wreck these institutions, because in fact what's really happened is that the elite in many countries, in the Western countries, have gained control to such an extent that these institutions that should work just don't work anymore. And so what's gone on is when you defund things, then these institutions don't work. And then the game is, okay, well, we must pass them off to these individualistic private people who, from business who will run things better. Well, I'll talk later on, perhaps, not today, but later, about how economically that's not viable. It's just not viable and can never work. However, so what we, in conjunction with all of this, we see how the mass populations are easily duped. And we saw this in the 30s. I mean, there's no doubt that the Italians just loved Mussolini because he made, the Germans just worshipped Hitler. And that actually dissolved into the biggest bloodbath the world has ever seen. And so with people like Marine Le Pen getting 30-odd% vote in France, with people like Farage in England, and even Theresa May, who seems to be setting herself up as a mini dictator, gaining mass approval. And here we saw the mass population going for a person like Trump. Now, almost in every case, we see this population being duped by these people, and that basically these people will bring in policies which are totally against the interest of these people. And I find it just staggering that this duping goes on and continues to go on. I can't believe it, that somebody could, like Trump, could actually be believed that he could do any of these things. I mean, about the only things he's proposed so far is to reduce taxes on the rich and the corporations, and just how on earth that's going to make working people better or take this country back to some mythical past, I have no idea. You know, but the plain fact is in life is there is such a thing as collective action. You know, and unless people learn it, how to harness it, where they all row together. I used to row in eight. If you hear an eight, the top eights, you can hear that synchronism in action. Is really wonderful to hear, and the same with the country. You know, now what goes on with these wrecking balls? People like Trump, Theresa May, Le Pen, they wreck stuff, and what they leave behind is a trail of rubble. And that's what I'm worried about. This country won't, you know, it needs tremendous change actually, and that's what people called for in voting for Obama. But he didn't have the wit or the power or whatever to bring it about. Now Trump, I mean, it's the same thing, but he's not the person either. Now amongst this, you know, this 300 million people, there must be people that have some brains, so it's hard to see sometimes, you know, and so, you know, I come back and watch what goes on, and stuff goes on here that beyond the bounds of reason, really, in normal government societies, and there's, you know, people look at America with amazement, you know, how in a civilized country could such things happen, you know, and how could people be outright liars be believed? But in every country they seem to be. So I don't know. I think you know, it's as my wife says, well, if you look at all this, you go crazy. You know? So I think I'll try not to look at it too much because I'm probably half crazy already. But there you go.
Out, I did campaign for Bernie Sanders and I campaigned for Barack Obama, and I would have voted for Hillary if I lived in a battleground state. But since here in Texas, we get to choose whoever we want because it doesn't really matter because of the electoral college system and all that. So I voted green. So there's that. Now Trump won the electoral college by lying a lot. And he lied about three things that he actually had in common with Bernie Sanders, who's been saying the same things for about 40 years. Number one, the money in politics corrodes everything. And everybody agrees with this. It's like 90% of Americans know that the money in politics is totally corrosive. When you give a whole bunch of money to somebody, it's not just because you like them. They know there's strings attached. If you're going to get more of it, you better play the tune. And I think Trump played that card very well. In the Republican debates, he looked at all the other candidates and he said, I give a lot of these guys money and they do what I tell them to. Right? Remember this?
I do.
All right. He played that card perfect because all the Republicans, well, probably 90% of Republicans and all the Democrats agree that money in politics is totally toxic. And he played that card. He lied. If you look at his, his flyer and when they tell you who you're voting for, there's no solution to that. You know, elect more billionaires, something like that. Now Bernie Sanders has recently come out and said that he wants to have publicly financed campaigns, which is called clean elections, where if you qualify, if you get enough signatures on your petition, you are sponsored by the government. If somebody like Trump runs, wants to spend a bunch of money, you are on a level playing field. So nobody's got more money than anybody else. Now the media never talks about this because who gets the money? The media. So who gets most of their information from the TV? Anybody in here? Okay. Most Americans get their information from the TV. Now that's like 70%, I don't know what it is. I don't even want it. My TV barely works. So most people are getting their information from a system that gets that money. So they're not interested in talking about getting that money out of politics. That's number one. Number two, the Iraq War. Trump came out and said, oh, the Iraq War was based on lies, and he said it that clearly. I mean, he said it more clearly than any Democrat has ever said it. That it was based on lies, it was a total fabrication, we never should have gone in there, et cetera, et cetera. Now, he was lying again, because when he was on Howard Stern before the war, he said, yeah, we should go into there. He didn't say it strongly, but he was lying. He was not against the war before the war. He came out against it afterwards, and in his mind, who knows what the, he probably doesn't even know what the truth is. Number 3, the trade deals. We've been locked into some really bad trade deals, NAFTA being one of them, which anybody ever worked in a blue collar job? Any blue collar workers here? Okay, how many of you guys think that we should be competing with Mexicans who make $2 a day, or Chinese people who make 50 cents a day? This is insane. These trade deals were signed under Bill Clinton. Okay, they were endorsed by the corporate Democrats who were paid very, very well to go along with these deals.
Bipartisan.
It was bipartisan. I mean, Papa Bush actually couldn't pass it. It had to be handed to Clinton in order to actually get it through. Bill Clinton could go to the Democrats and twist enough arms to get it through, because all the Republicans were for it, and then you had to get a few Democrats to go for it, and it could go through. That's how it got passed. Bush did most of the work. Clinton passed it. Of course, during the election, Clinton was against it. Blah, blah, blah. He makes long statements that kind of have a lot of wiggle room in them, just the way Hillary did about the TPP. Okay, so fracking, TPP, Wall Street money, all these things. I mean, Hillary was a very, very centrist, if not right of center person. She wanted to have a no-fly zone in Syria. That means we got to shoot down Russian planes if they violate the no-fly zone. If you want a no-fly zone where there's already Russian planes flying around, that's a war.
It is.
It's a declaration of war. If somebody said to us, well, you can't fly over Texas or we'll shoot you down, that's a declaration of war. We have a military-industrial complex that is completely out of control. Eisenhower, spelled it out as best he could, and then he ran for it. Kennedy got killed probably because he was messing with it. Who knows? He shut down the Bay of Pigs, all this other stuff. This is back when I was born, so this is history that you have to learn and actually understand these things. But you don't get it from the media. Media doesn't tell you that the United States has been overthrowing governments all over the world. They don't tell you, why they want to overthrow Syria right now. We want to put a pipeline from the Qatar or somebody there. It's going to go through and then get to Europe. We want to build a pipeline through Syria. We've been trying to build that for decades now. And we're making up stories about how Assad is gassing his people, and those are lies. And the media is telling you the same things over and over and over again, and they just put it on loop. They put it on repeat. And once we hear it enough times, we think, oh yeah, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. They have them. I mean, obviously. We have to be smarter. We have to watch for, we have to be better consumers of the news. And I don't know, the solution is the Democratic Party right now is run by corporate people who are very tied to the large money interests. Barack Obama could have given us single payer or at least a public option. He could have gone around, twisted a few arms, got it done. He was paid very, very well, and all of his people around him were paid very, very well to not let that happen. We didn't even get to have a debate about whether to have single payer or public option. We didn't even get to have that debate. Now, think about that. If Democrats can't stand for single payer public option and tell people, conservatives especially, it's cheaper, it saves money. There's 30% overhead we're just throwing away. We got drug companies that are just ripping us off. We got insurance companies ripping us off. Who gets all their money? The media. The media will not tell us these things. We've got to learn them some other way. YouTube, talk to your friends, but Bernie Sanders is saying these things flat out, and they pretty much, they killed him by not talking about it. During the primary, he was having rallies with 10, 15,000 people in that stadium. The media would show up Trump's podium empty. All right? They blacked him out during most of the primary. DNC did their own little things, and that all came out in the WikiLeaks. That's not really what happened. I mean, that's not the worst thing that happened. The worst thing was the media. The media blacked him out. They would not talk about him. They would talk about Trump, and Trump. And it was very frustrating. I went up to Iowa to campaign for Bernie. Spent about a week up there trudging around in the snow, talking to people. There were a lot of people, conservatives and independents, that I talked to. They kind of like Bernie because he's at least consistent. They disagree with, you know, they thought he was a communist, you know, and they really didn't like a lot of what he stood for. But they said, you know what, he's solid, you know, he's consistent. And they did not like Hillary. I mean, there were some people that liked Hillary a lot, but I went to the Hillary rally here in Dallas. It was very, very small. There was like a gymnasium, you know, like a college gymnasium full of people. And I went to the Bernie rally, and it was the Verizon Center. I mean, it was huge, it was packed, and people, you know, had all this energy. Now, I don't know if he could have lived up to all those things. I mean, probably not. No politician ever does. But at least he's been saying that same thing for 40 years, really consistently. And when you watch the YouTube videos, you can kind of watch him, you know, get gray hairs while he's saying the same thing over and over and over again. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I think I'm the last one standing, so I gotta thank our speaker for doing a great job here tonight. Oh, I'm last one.
I thought I got my 5 minutes.
You do, after I get 2.
Oh, you actually gonna say something?
I get to say something if I want to, you know. So anyway, I'm forgetting what I wanted to say. That's
You can, Tom. We can repeat it for you.
all right. Anyway, there was I forgot what I was going to say. So anyway,
I am so sorry that I interrupted your train of thought.
it did. Somebody did. It just went. I had it all there and bingo it went. But I should have wrote it down. Didn't. But maybe I'll think of it.
Well, look at the people who spoke and see which person, or you're looking at me.
Oh, yeah. Anyway.
But all of you who spoke stood up so he can decide whether it's me or him, you that he wants to.
Go ahead, Tom.
Anyway, I forgot what I was going to say. I really do. It's sad. It was all there, and now it escaped me.
It went with your hair.
Maybe that's it. You know, the hair or something went. It was a good speech too.
Money in politics.
Yay, Tom.
Anyway, it just
Money in politics.
money in politics. Well,
Let her finish
Bernie
up.
Sanders.
yeah, I'm gonna let you finish up. But I'm just trying to see if I can recapture some of what I lost. But
Shorter work week.
no, that isn't it.
6-hour work day.
6-hour day isn't it either. But what I'm looking at is
Press.
the press. The problem today is that
Hey,
we got the best Congress money can buy. That's our biggest problem. And no matter what we do, we can't get Congress to change. In my view, the solution to, if you're looking for solutions, the solution to the problem is to have free elections the last 90 days of a general election. The media won't like it, but they can always raise the price on the other advertising. And Congress will vote for it because they get to keep the money they raise. They don't have to spend all their money. They keep the money. There's no history of a challenger being an incumbent, so they'll vote for it. And once they put it in, things will change because then some challengers will beat some incumbents. And when that happens, everything will change because then they'll represent the people who do the electing instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington. That's the big problem we have. We got corporations controlling government. By definition, that's fascism, and that's where our country has gone. And we're in deep trouble in that respect. We're $19 trillion in debt and growing, and most of it is overseas imbalance of trade. Apple produces everything in China, what Chinese people doing the producing, and they sell it here. But we don't have the jobs here because they're over there. So the end result is, what is the solution? The solution is to put tariffs on the corporate. If you try to put a tariff in another country, you have a price war. You put a tariff on Mexico, that's what Trump wants to do, it's not gonna work. And you put a tariff on Mexico, put a tariff on you, and you're gonna have a price war. Or if you put a tariff on a corporation, there's nothing to stop you from doing that. And once you put a tariff on a corporation, you tell Apple, you gotta, well, what's the tariff gonna be? The difference in transportation costs, the difference in labor costs, the difference in taxes, that'll be your tariff. You don't wanna pay it, produce it here. You won't have to worry about it. Once you do that, you get your jobs back. And once you do that, you can shorten the workday and put people back to work. Maybe let people paying taxes instead of draining taxes, and we have a better society. Anyway, that's my view. But that's what we have to move to do. Right now, one other thought I had was on Trump, and that is that if you notice, he wants to raise the military budget. We have the biggest military budget in the world right now, and he wants to make it even bigger. And in the process, he wants to cut everything else. And for example, you mentioned that I think it's 30% they want to cut in the State Department. This is the people that do the negotiating with other countries for diplomatic reasons, etc. If you stop that, you're going to have a war because you're not going to be dealing with people. And that's not what you need. You don't need wars. We need peace. We need people working. We need a shorter workday. We need all these different things. And we need a government that works for the people instead of us working for them. That's what's happened. Anyway, I'll give this back to our speaker. She gets a comment and a comment for this meeting.
Came back to you.
Some of it came back.
Thank you all. Every one of you have had such interesting comments and thoughtful comments, and I am feel that I learn every time I come here, even if it's not that I agree every time with what you have to say. The fact is that all of you all think and read and discuss issues, and issues matter. With respect to this idea of clean elections, which is really translated, I think, to be free elections. There's no such thing as free, but we are really in deep trouble. I agree that there's too much corporate money and too much rich people's money in the campaigns and in all of the things that relate to our campaigns. We have a serious problem when we say and think that we would be able, if we had it free and everybody could run. Somebody's going to have to pay for that, and that'd be the tax, from our taxes. I don't know about you all, but for a long time on our tax returns, we could check a box that would be like $3 to go toward paying for, free presidentially supported. Yeah, I mean, I always have given that, but we know it's not enough. The thing that we would not be able to do, given the state of the law now, is to say that that's the only money that could be spent. So we're not, I think that that's the problem. I think we've got to maybe come up with some way to say constitutionally, through a constitutional amendment, that there are limitations on how much money can be put into elections. It's not a matter of free, in my view, it's not free speech for a corporation to be able to put money in to elections. I think that's ridiculous. But so far, the Supreme Court hasn't agreed with me. I don't know why, but just the way it is. Now, with respect to John's comments about President Bush and, why don't we give him a chance? The thing that I found really interesting is I didn't hear John say one single thing that Bush stood for that he agreed with. I understand that change in the abstract is nice, but there's enough facts out about our president that cause me grave concern. I believe that he has admitted, and I know that it's available both through internet searches and off the standard media, that he has financed a lot of those wonderful Trump buildings through loans out of China and Russia. So I find that his stances toward Russia are a little bit too convenient. If you feel like we've got too much American money or corporate money in elections, consider how much money has been put into supporting Trump. I mean, just look at this. Every time he goes to one of his Trump properties, if it's Florida, it's $3 million. But more than that, all the people that have to go with him, the Secret Service has to go with him. You know, this adds up. It's not a nickel and dime. When his children go off to do their deals in China or God knows where, we're paying for that because they get the Secret Service now. In spite of the fact they're quite wealthy and could pay for their own security, they don't turn down Secret Service, and so that's costing us money. When we have Melania living in New York to keep Barron in school, which I understand, that's a lot of money it's costing us. So Trump cost us a huge amount of money just to be president. And then when you look at his ideas, you could consider his tax reform proposals. That's really just a transfer of money from people who really need it on the poor side of our economy to the wealthiest people who think they don't have enough. I don't understand that myself, and I don't agree with Trump on that. He didn't drain any swamp. He populated every cabinet office with a fellow swamp dweller. So I think what he wants to do is get rid of your career federal employees who understand what the law is and what the regs and what the requirements are in these federal agencies. So that would cost us money because we would not have people who knew how the service was to come to us, whatever part of the government we're talking about. Then, with respect to Bernie, I think after a man's had 40 years to persuade either his city that he was in as a mayor, councilman, state legislature, the federal Senate, the federal House, the federal Senate, and not a single one of his plans has he ever persuaded enough people to vote and support it. And that was long before we had Citizens United and stuff like that. So I am as entertained as the next person by hearing Bernie talk. But I know, based on his 40 years of what he's accomplished, that that's all it is. So I recognize, as I think probably everybody in this room does, that we have not got a perfect party. The Democratic Party is not perfect, and it's got a lot of the problems that you identified, and that is not something I'm going to argue about. But if you want to talk about who over a 100-year period maybe has, when they are the majority, passed laws that actually support the middle class, actually support the people who are what we call working poor. There's a difference between being working poor and being middle class, as anyone who has been in any of these categories knows good and well. And we have people who, maybe it's their fault, I don't think so, but who don't earn enough money, who don't have access to money, and they live in abysmal poverty. And so the only people that have ever done anything to begin to address these issues are the Democrats. It's like education. Now we can talk about education, and we can say, well, we ought to have better education, we ought to have better student loans, we ought to have this and that. I agree, but I haven't ever seen much done. I know that oddly enough, Richard Nixon, whom we have all criticized, or I would criticize him, was one of the ones who was able to get he got the Environmental Protection Act passed, as I recall. He also opened communications and relations with China, which was huge. So, unfortunately, he was a crook. But, but we have, you know, you get the awards, and maybe that Trump will do something that will be really positive and we'll appreciate that he does. As an American, I hope that that happens. But he's still a crook. And that's what I have to say about that. Thank you all.
Trump polluted the swamp.
Well, that's it for, Margaret, you want to, come on up here.
I'm getting ready to leave.
I know, but you
Just
want
to
to,
remind-
Go ahead, you tell them.
Yeah, if anybody else needs one of these announcements about my husband's memorial service, see me. I'm getting ready to pay my bill. See you all.
did you hear what she said?
I absolutely did.
Good. Then I don't have to repeat it.
Good. Good.
They kick us out of here at 10 o'clock, so just so you know, and you're free to converse with people.
I think what I
And
might do
the
is
formal part of this meeting is over until next week, so thank you. See you next week.